Chair, and thank you so much for your bravery. It's a difficult and emotional situation, and my heart bleeds for you. So thank you for coming and sharing your stories with us today. So I'm going to direct my first question to Kim. So I was reviewing some of your notes and some of the segment that I've watched. And one of the things that you said really stuck with me, and I'm going to quote it. It said, "This is an important first step that must lead to a national, independent, third-party judicial investigation led by human rights experts." This is a quote that you made. We have been clear that the Office of Sport Integrity Commissioner is not equipped to handle these investigations. They lack independence, power to compel, and they are directly funded by Sports Canada, who has time and time again failed Canadian athletes. What would you say to this committee that a third party be organized by athletes and people that are in a better position to understand what has happened? Could you elaborate on that?
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the question. I'd like to hand that answer over to my colleague, Amelia Cline, Gymnasts for Change.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I think it is critically important that any third-party judicial inquiry be led by athletes and particularly by survivors. Survivors have a very unique experience in sport that they can bring to bear when it comes to especially drafting, for example, the terms of reference for any sort of investigation. What we've learned from speaking with the other countries that have undertaken investigations such as these is that it is vitally important that the terms of reference be crafted in such a way that they will actually get to the root issues within the investigation. So even at the outset of any sort of effort to create an independent investigation, survivors need to be consulted.
So maybe you can answer this for me too, and correct me if I'm wrong, but once a coach or an individual has been charged, I understand that there's no registry?
That's correct. So in certain sports, and I can really only speak to gymnastics because that's my experience, but Gymnastics Canada has a suspended and banned list that is publicly available. However, there's no discipline history that is provided publicly. So if someone is suspended for a year, for example, it will show up that they have been suspended, but as soon as their suspension is over, their name disappears from that list. So there's no way for parents to know whether they're being coached by someone who actually has a discipline history. And certainly there is no national coaching registry that would show the discipline history of coaches in other sports either. So there is the theoretical possibility that a coach could be banned from gymnastics, for example, and then begin coaching in soccer or football or hockey. And there's no clear way to for parents or for individuals to track where these coaches end up after they've been disciplined.
So you mentioned that other countries are ahead of us by 2 years. From their example, what do they do to ensure that these particular individuals, or how do they stop these particular individuals from getting involved in other sports?
So in a number of different countries, they've tried various different things. So currently in the UK, there are efforts underway to actually change the legislative framework around much of this. So better safeguarding, better, stronger child rights efforts that essentially, as we've been saying, this is a human rights issue as opposed to a sporting issue. This is really a child's rights issue. So the more that legislative change can be made, policy change can be made to essentially take a child-centric, child protection approach to these issues, that seems to be the discussion that's happening in other jurisdictions.
So would you agree that, like any other abuser, that record should never be expunged and it should be released to the public and stay there permanently? would that not help to ensure that these individuals never, ever, ever have the opportunity of abusing a child again?
Absolutely. And I often use the example of other trust-based professions, so teachers, doctors, lawyers. We all have public disciplinary records, and that's because we're in such a position of power and such a position of trust with the public that it's recognized that we give up some of our privacy rights in an effort to protect the public if we were to abuse that power. And I see that being analogous to the position that coaches are in, especially in sports such as gymnastics, where the people that they have power over are these very vulnerable children. Why wouldn't we have a publicly available discipline record at that point?
Thank you so much for that very, very honest answer. I saw that, Ms. Cline, you looked like you wanted to add something to that, so I'll just give the rest of the time for you to also respond to that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If you'll indulge me a few extra seconds. You referenced that Gymnastics Canada has had effectively the same harassment officer for approximately 30 years. Dr. Gretchen Kerr, we understand, has been the go-to harassment officer for primarily most of the complaints that have come through Gymnastics Canada in the last 30 years. In those 30 years, unfortunately, what we have now been reported to us is that abuse has thrived in that time. So we have serious concerns and serious reservations about how complaints have been handled. We have received some very concerning reports regarding Dr. Kerr's conduct. We will be circulating a 5-page brief in which a story in that regard will be articulated to the committee. Essentially, it involves the sexual abuse of several athletes, some of whom were minors. Initially, Gymnastics Canada told those complainants that because the person who was the perpetrator was no longer under contract, Gymnastics Canada could not investigate. They eventually opened an investigation when the Centre for Ethics in Sport insisted that Gymnastics Canada open an investigation. I have a copy of the report that Dr. Kerr created. It essentially summarizes the allegations, but it makes no findings whatsoever of whether those reports were credible. It declines to offer any sort of discipline for that individual, and instead says that the complainants should report it to the massage college. And it then recommends that if that individual ever reapplies to work for Gymnastics Canada, that her file should be reviewed. So there is no discipline history for this person who allegedly has sexually abused at least 5 athletes, some of whom, again, were minors. There was no contact with the police, we understand, from Gymnastics Canada when they received these reports. And so as a result, this individual could theoretically continue working not just in gymnastics, but in other sports because there is currently no discipline history. So when you ask why this has continued to be a problem for decades, it is exactly problems like that that we are concerned about.
You talked about the Office of the Sport Integrity Commissioner that was put in place. Do athletes trust that office, and can you explain why?
Thank you for the question. I don't believe athletes do trust this system that has been set up. There are a number of reasons for that. It is still very deeply embedded within the sport system that, as you've been hearing this morning, athletes do not trust. A good example of that is that the Office of the Sport Integrity Commissioner is overseen by the SDRCC. On the SDRCC board, appointed earlier this year, is a person who also sat on the board of Gymnastics Canada. And when he was initially appointed to the SDRCC board, he in fact was still an active board member of Gymnastics Canada. That is the body that oversees the Office of the Sport Integrity Commissioner. So how does any gymnast have any trust in an office that is being overseen by the very people that would need to be investigated? There are a number of different ways in which we are concerned that this office is not equipped to investigate these matters. There's no subpoena power, as Kim was alluding to. There's no ability to compel these NSOs to participate in any sort of review. There's no ability to enforce any recommendations that come out of a report from the Office of the Sport Integrity Commissioner. We understand that the office is working hard to try to shore up some of those gaps, but at the moment it is not equipped to investigate the types of abuses that we are seeing come forward.
Adrienne, your time is up. I'll make sure that we get around to you, though, one more time. Your time is up. Okay, Leah, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chair. And I just want to start off by thanking all of the witnesses today for coming forward with quite raw truths. And I just want to say to Madame Shore, I was very touched when you spoke about the fact that when you came forward to disclose abuse, that people didn't believe you, and just to acknowledge how violent that is and how re-traumatizing that is. And so I'm sorry I'm emotional. To say I hope that you have some justice here, all of you, that people will hear you and acknowledge your truth. So I just wanted to start off with that. And just to say that I absolutely agree with the witnesses that this is an absolute human rights crisis, certainly a failure to uphold the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, specifically, for example, Article 19, which states that parties shall take all appropriate legislative, administrative, social, and educational measures to protect the child from all forms of physical or mental violence, injury or abuse, neglect, or negligent treatment, maltreatment, or exploitation, including sexual abuse, while in the care of parents, legal guardians, or any other person who has the care of the child. And I was really struck by one of the things that you spoke about, Ms. Cline, which is the fact that there's no requirement for coaches, for example, to have to take an abuse registry check, something that is required. I was a teacher, something that was required of all teachers, and I also was an early childhood educator, something that is required even for early childhood educators to have an abuse registry check. Do you think changing the regulations to make that a requirement would make a difference in the protection of children?
Thank you. I certainly do think that would be a very important change. I think what we have seen is, again, sport being able to operate outside of many of the other norms that other professions already adhere to. And it's never made a lot of sense to me that that's been an exception, given how vulnerable child athletes are. So I think developing a national-wide child abuse registry for coaches certainly would impact.